Dear all, welcome to this academic session at which Professor Fons Coomans will deliver his farewell address after a wonderful day with many of you at the symposium held in honor of his retirement. Well, retirement. We do not believe that after today Professor Coomans will be completely out of the picture, but more on that in a moment. My name is Pamela Habibovic, and as rector of this beautiful university, I have a pleasure of leading this session. I am sure Professor Coomans will take you through his life's work, which started in 1985 here at Maastricht University. When it comes to the content of his work, he is best placed to express it himself. Therefore, after a brief sketch of his career, I would like to focus on Fons Coomans as a person and why it is only logical that he occupies a UNESCO chair that revolves around human rights and peace. Although he was born in The Hague, he came to Maastricht at an early age. During his teens, he already had a drink at the tribunal, the regular bar of many Maastricht law professors, just around the corner from the faculty. In 1992, he obtained his doctorate here with a thesis on international protection of the right to education as a human right, supervised by Professor van Boven and Professor Flinteman, who are with us today. The right to education remained one of his most important themes. However, the right to health, food, and the right to benefit from scientific progress were also always high on his agenda. When it comes to these socio-economic rights, Professor Coomans really put Maastricht on the map, together with other peers, just as he played an important role in development of the Center for Human Rights, established in 1993 by Professor van Boven and Professor Flinteman, of which he was the director for a very long time. With them and others, he also left his mark on the Maastricht guidelines and principles. Professor Coomans has published extensively, including a renowned book on methods on human rights research in 2009. Whenever possible, he sought to connect with practice, for example, in a PhD project on healthy primary schools that is still running, or the Shelter City project that he co-founded to offer human rights activists from abroad time to do research in the Netherlands. In 2017, he was one of the initiators of the Human Rights of Future Generations initiative. This group of experts advocates for the rights of future generations, such as the right to life, food, housing, health, and clean environment. The group wants to create a legal basis for the survival of humanity, for which an inclusive and green society is more urgent than ever. One way to give this legal shape is to establish the human rights of future generations. Maastricht University has taken the initiative to draft a legal expert opinion, the Maastricht Principles, which explains the human rights of future generations and the severe risks that have been imposed on future generations. And you will understand, this project is far from finished. Just like a number of PhD students who are still working on their dissertations, so those geraniums, which in the Netherlands you proverbially sit behind after you retire, are still a long way off. And we expect to see Professor Coomans at the faculty from time to time. Thank goodness for that. Because when you hear how his colleagues talk about him, you understand that he is really a people's person. How could it be otherwise with his chair in human rights and peace? He is a good listener, they say, and really interested in others. He is averse to hierarchy and takes a lot of time for young researchers who are finding their way in science and facing other challenges. People come to him with challenges they might face because they know how approachable he is. He only talks positively about others, and he doesn't talk much about himself. He prefers to talk with the other person, and he always asks the question, "How are you?" And then he's incredibly generous with his time. Everyone agrees Professor Coomans has no ego. As head of the International and European Law Department, he was also greatly appreciated by his colleagues in that role for his listening ear, his good advice, and, where necessary, his discreet solutions. As mentioned, Professor Coomans does not talk much about himself. However, I am sure he and his wife Lillian will find plenty of time plenty to do with the time they have at their disposal after today. Hiking, perhaps? Seeking the peace and quiet of the French countryside? Immersing themselves in African art and music? Discovering an island again? As long as it is not uninhabited, I would say. Because the life and work of Professor Coomans revolves around people, and we are grateful that he has shaped a part of his life at our university. I would like now to give the floor to Professor Fons Coomans for his farewell address entitled Towards 2122 and Beyond, Developing the Human Rights of Future Generations. Professor Coomans.
Mevrouw de rector, gewaardeerde toehoorders. On the 1st of September 1985, I started my career as wetenschappelijk assistent at the Faculty of Law of Maastricht University. I was recruited by Kees Flinterman, one of the founding fathers of the faculty. Soon after that, Kees and Theo van Boven set up a project group on human rights research. I became a member, and after some time it was agreed that I should write a PhD thesis on the human right to education, which I defended in 1992. Since then, a lot has happened in human rights law and human rights research. The Maastricht Center for Human Rights was established in 1993. It became well known for its research on economic, social, and cultural rights. At the time, a set of rights underdeveloped and under-researched, and sometimes called the stepchild of the human rights family. Already back in 1986, the Limburg Principles on the nature of state parties' obligations under the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights were adopted at an expert meeting in Maastricht to clarify these rights. I attended that meeting as a very junior expert and junior researcher. This is a picture taken at the expert meeting in Hotel Maastricht, and you can see me, a very junior person on the left. Since then, economic, social, and cultural rights have never left me. They have been a source of inspiration for my own research, many collaborative projects, PhD research by young colleagues, and cooperation with academia and non-governmental organizations. I have always been intrigued by the question how human rights law can be pushed further with a view to responding to societal changes and challenges and contribute to a society that is more fair. In other words, normative legal research about how the law should develop de lege ferenda. In this address, I want to look back at this period since 1985 by highlighting a number of key achievements from the perspective of this process of progressive development of the law on economic, social, and cultural rights. In the second part, I want to discuss the latest developments in this ongoing process of pushing the law further, namely developing the human rights of members of future generations. When we follow the news, it is abundantly clear that the planet is in crisis. The future of mankind is at stake in light of the ongoing and very serious threats. Climate change, the reduction of potable water supplies, floods, depletion of natural resources, the lack of renewable energy stocks, the risk of nuclear conflict, loss of biodiversity, a severe burden of financial debts on future generations, and the continuous stimulus to reach higher levels of economic growth instead of trends towards degrowth. The Global Footprint Network has calculated and reported that everything the Earth has to offer this year in terms of resources and food has been consumed in less than 7 months. On the 28th of July last, it was Earth Overshoot Day, the day on which humankind had run out of its annual stock. What do these risks and threats mean for members of future generations? And can the law, and in particular human rights law, deal with these challenges and risks? This slide shows our carbon footprint. A carbon footprint is the total amount of greenhouse gases that are generated by our action. The average carbon footprint for a person in the United States is 16 tons, one of the highest rates in the world. Globally, the average carbon footprint is closer to 4 tons. Close to home, there is a hot debate about the need to reduce nitrogen emissions to save nature and the planet for future generations. But at the same time, this probably means expropriating land and farms from farmers, thus interfering with their right to property. Is this legitimate and justified from the perspective of intergenerational justice and equity? These are tough questions to deal with. Is it possible to strike a balance between the different interests at stake, or should one be courageous and forward-looking with a view to preserving life on Earth? What role can human rights law play in this discussion? In my work, I have been inspired by the mission of the Maastricht Center for Human Rights, namely that research carried out by the members of the center aims to be at the cutting edge of global human rights research and to be forward-looking in its choice of research themes. Research should be about subjects that raise fundamental questions about human rights as opposed to mere technicalities. But also that human rights are about the daily lives of human beings, as expressed in an apt way by Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of the former American president Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I quote, "Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, the farm or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted action, citizen action to uphold them closely to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the world, in the larger world," unquote. As academics, we have our responsibilities for sound legal research. We should not be led by wishful thinking and preconceived conclusions about how human rights law ideally should develop. There must always be a solid basis in existing sources of human rights law to be able to develop it further. However, we also have our responsibilities towards society. Academics often contribute to tactically analyzing international norms and procedures, which has occasionally become an end in itself. People often ask the legitimate question, what do your human rights do for me? So as academics, we have to be aware of the societal role and impact of human rights standards and procedures, in particular for those who are at risk. Two issues have always been appealing to me in my life as a researcher. namely the question how vague international standards on human rights can be clarified and do justice to the object and purpose of the legal instrument of which they are part. And secondly, how human rights should deal with challenging societal phenomena, such as poverty and climate change, where clear standards are missing. Over the years, I have found and created a niche area in which for a long period of time only few researchers had been working, namely the international protection of economic, social, and cultural rights, and underlying general issues, such as the nature of state obligations, identifying violations, international monitoring and supervision by UN procedures and mechanisms. There is a number of rights on which I have worked in particular, namely the right to education, the right to food, the right to health, and the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress. What these human rights have in common is that their normative content has been obscure for a long time. They have been seen as aspirations, aims of governmental programs, and policies which could not be put in the law. This has changed since the late 1980s, when academics began to show an interest in these rights and the ensuing state obligations. The work by scholars such as Henry Shue, Asbjørn Eide, and Philip Alston has inspired me and influenced me and has influenced my own thinking and work greatly. This normative approach, with a focus on the implementation and protection of economic, social, and cultural rights, has led to important expert opinions that were adopted under the auspices of the Maastricht Center for Human Rights, but in collaboration with other academic partners. And I want to stress this, key international NGOs working on these rights. I want to mention here in particular long-standing collaboration with one NGO, Food First Information and Action Network, FIAN, but also the International Commission of Jurists in Geneva, and more recently, the Center for International and Environmental Law. These expert opinions have had an impact on the academic discourse, but also on soft law documents adopted by UN treaty bodies, in particular, general comments. The latter constitute authoritative opinions on how human rights and obligations should be interpreted and implemented at the domestic and international level. As examples, I would like to mention the 1986 Limburg Principles, already mentioned, the 1997 Maastricht Guidelines on Violations of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the 2011 Maastricht Principles on the extraterritorial obligations of states in the area of economic, social, and cultural rights. The latter expert opinion deals with the activities of states beyond national borders that have an impact on the human rights and the nature of their obligations. This is about the need for global justice in an era of unfettered economic globalization. This was also the subject of my inaugural address back in 2007. But let's now look ahead. What does human rights law have to say about the huge challenges mankind is facing today, such as climate change, loss of biodiversity, and the depletion of natural resources? It is well known that a number of domestic and regional courts have paved the way for an approach which would encompass the human rights of future generations. An example is the Dutch Urgenda case. In that case, the District Court of The Hague ruled, and I quote, "The possibility of damages for those whose interest Urgenda represents, including current and future generations of Dutch nationals, is so great and concrete that given its duty of care, the state must make an adequate contribution greater than its current contribution to prevent hazardous climate change," unquote. The human rights at stake were the right to life and the right to private and family life, included in the European Convention on Human Rights. Another major step was the recognition and adoption of the right to a healthy environment as a human right by member states of the UN Human Rights Council and the General Assembly in a recent resolution. These are important steps, however quite fragmented and limited to climate issues and the environment. What is needed, in my view, is a more comprehensive document which states and explains the human rights of members of future generations and the obligations of present states that flow from it. In the second part of this address, I will explain the rationale for a set of principles laying down the human rights of future generations. What are the underlying legal, moral, and ethical notions? Who are entitled to these rights? Who has obligations, and what type of obligations? And which legal sources can and should be used in support of the recognition of these human rights? What will follow next is a bit of history to describe the background of the so-called Maastricht Initiative to explain, in a legal expert opinion, the human rights of future generations. In 2017, Rolf Kuneman from FIAN and I took the initiative to bring together a number of academics, representatives of human rights NGOs and civil society organizations, with a view to discuss and agree on a legal expert opinion on the human rights of future generations, similar to the other three human rights expert opinions that were adopted in Maastricht. A steering group was established composed of academics from Lancaster University, Maastricht University, FIAN, and the Center for International and Environmental Law. We reached out to experts and organizations in different branches of law, such as environmental law, constitutional law, human rights law, and public international law, from the north and the south, and asked for their opinions and input. Over the years, we organized meetings and consultations and established an online interactive database where resources and working materials have been posted. In 2021, the decision was taken that time had come to establish a small group of 7 experts with as terms of reference to draft a set of principles which explains the human rights of future generations. The group is composed of legal experts coming from different regions and backgrounds, including one expert with an indigenous background. The principles should be drawn from existing human rights law and other branches of law, but always build upon it to contribute to the progressive development of the law. The text should not propose new human rights, and it should have a solid legal basis. So far, the group of experts has produced a draft text that will be open for consultation in October. Next, a meeting of the experts group is planned for February 2023 in Maastricht. At that meeting, the final draft text will hopefully be agreed upon, finalized, and adopted. The perspective from which the human rights of future generations should be approached is the understanding that what is at stake presently is an existential threat to humankind and the planet, in light of the need to protect and preserve life and nature. How will people living 100 years from now, in 2122, look at us? I have been inspired by the book by the philosopher Roman Krasnajik, The Good Ancestor, who has asked a number of uneasy and worrying questions. Have we behaved like good ancestors? What do we leave behind for our future generations? How will future generations remember us? Will they hold us accountable? Recently, Dutch Prime Minister Rutte, talking about the period of Dutch colonial slavery in the past, asked the question, can you hold people that live today responsible for something that happened generations ago? For our topic, that question can be rephrased as, can you hold people responsible that live today for something that will happen generations from now in the future? My answer would be yes, because there is ample scientific evidence about the future effects of our current conduct. Thinking about life in the distant future has always been a source of inspiration for writers and artists. When I was a teenager, there used to be a very popular song on the radio called In the Year 2525. One of the verses of the song went like this: in the year 9595, I'm kind of wondering if man is gonna be alive. He has taken everything this old earth can give, and he ain't put back nothing. Why do we need a set of principles on the human rights of future generations? The most obvious and simple reason is to make sure that the basic human rights of future people are recognized today as part of the law and be given effect now and in the future. A set of principles would fill a normative gap, laying down the substance of human rights that do not, of human rights of people that do not exist. Principles would clarify who is to be held accountable when the human rights of future people are jeopardized. Thirdly, which protection mechanisms and remedies exist that can be used to vindicate the rights of future generations. Why should we bother about the human rights of members of future generations? Is it our responsibility? There are a number of underlying principles that provide a legal, moral, and ethical justification for accepting and confirming the human rights of future people. First of all, there is the principle of universality of human rights. In my view, this is a dynamic concept. In essence, it means that human rights apply always, everywhere, and for everyone. In my view, this includes people that are not yet born. If not, universality will be time-bound and qualified. So universality has an intertemporal dimension. Secondly, there is the principle of human dignity, which is said to be inherent to the human person. It would not make sense and be illogical to deny future people the right to live a life in dignity. Thirdly, the principle of intergenerational justice and fairness requires present generations not to burden future generations with situations and conditions that jeopardize the enjoyment of human rights, which many of us have been fully enjoying without much obstacles. The right to food and the right to water are an example. Another difficult issue to tackle is how doing justice to the human rights of future generations relates to the notion of progressive realization of social, economic, and cultural rights, which is the key notion of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights of 1966. Is the idea of achieving higher levels of realization of social economic rights and consequently the depletion of natural resources for the production of goods compatible with the notion of intergenerational justice and transgenerational responsibility? Linked to the idea of fairness between generations are more recent notions such as planetary health and sustainable development. The UN Sustainable Development Goals and its 2030 agenda refer to future generations. However, one may ask the question what the ambition and plan of action is beyond 2030. Does the agenda for sustainable development stop in 2030? Then there are a number of basic legal principles that underlie relations between states and provide guidance for the conduct and policies of governments. These include the do no harm principle, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and obligations between states in environmental law and climate law in particular. Another basic idea is the so-called public trust Doctrine, developed in the USA, which requires US federal and state governments to hold vital resources in trust for the public beneficiaries, both present and future generations. Of fundamental and key importance is the precautionary principle. It aims at protecting the environment from serious and irreversible harm by taking timely measures, even if there is no or not yet hard scientific evidence that the negative effects on the environment will occur. This principle has a solid basis in general international law, international environmental law, and domestic law. In principle, the principle is linked to the general duty of care, according to which states have to protect their citizens from harm resulting from environmental degradation now and in the future. So far, I have mentioned ideas and principles that have Western roots and backgrounds. It is interesting to note that indigenous concepts, knowledge, and principles may also guide the protection of the rights of future generations. One example is the so-called seventh generation principle, which dates back to the old Indian indigenous notions in North America of hundreds of years ago. It entails the idea that decisions that we take today about the use of water, energy, and natural resources should result in sustainable world 7 generations in the future. We can also be inspired by the work and ideas of classical and well-known legal scholars such as Hugo de Groot. In his time, Grotius filled a vacuum by legally defining natural law and areas that are beyond the national acquisition and sovereignty of states, the so-called the Coomans, nature, air, high seas, and the polar regions. What and how can we learn from the author of Mare Liberum to protect the commons, the planet, and prevent natural and man-made disasters? Can we formulate a new natural law that not only centers on human nature, but also involves nature itself as an unconditional part of existence? How do we protect, safeguard, and restore the commons, the forests, rivers, and natural resources for our future generations, if we are not able and willing to use and share these equally and responsibly today? If we talk about human rights of future generations, whose rights do we have in mind? In other words, are these individual rights or rather collective rights belonging to future generations as groups? This is a difficult question. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights refers to, and I quote, all members of the human family, unquote. It is impossible to identify individual people by name who do not exist yet. However, we know for sure that the human family at large is and will be composed of different generations, present and future ones. These must be treated on an equal basis. Each future generation is composed of individual human beings who should be seen as right holders, who are, however, unable to claim their rights right now. That is why they need to be represented by members of present generations, such as ombudspersons or trustees or guardians, who can speak and submit claims on their behalf. Examples from Wales, Hungary, and Israel show that this is possible and that practical arrangements can be made to give future generations a voice. A sensitive question is whether present children should be considered as members of future generations. Many social movements against climate change have been initiated by children, and indeed, they can be seen as powerful advocates for a change of governmental and human behavior. It is also true that most children under 15 years of age will live in the future for many years to come and will probably have difficulties in enjoying all human rights, such as the right to a healthy environment. However, in my view, they are not part of future generations because they already exist. In addition, they can rely on current human rights law to secure their rights. Which human rights do we have in mind in connection with future people? In principle, the idea of the universality of human rights implies that all the rights of the Universal Declaration apply to future people. However, there are a number of rights that are particularly relevant in light of present dangers. These include the right to life, subsistence and security, the right to food, water, housing, and health, and the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. These rights must be protected to secure human life in a sustainable way in the future, both at the short term and the longer term. If these conditions would be ignored, the idea of human rights as such would lose credibility as legal and moral directives. Is there a legal basis for the recognition of the human rights of future people in law? There are quite a number of treaties and national constitutions that contain a reference to the human rights or the rights of future generations, usually in the preamble, not in the operative parts. Examples of treaty provisions come from different branches of public international law, such as environmental law, the law on the conservation of natural species, and human rights law. An important new development is currently taking place within the framework of the Council of Europe. Its Parliamentary Assembly is proposing to add the right to a clean, safe, healthy, and sustainable environment to the European Convention on Human Rights. It defines this right as the right of present and future generations to live in a non-degraded, viable, and decent environment that is conducive to their health, development, and well-being. This means that future generations are recognized as right holders. States have duties towards these future generations. The extension to future generations as right holders is motivated by the principles of transgenerational justice, responsibility, equity, and solidarity. This is a promising development. When the rights of members of future generations are recognized as human rights, it is self-evident that other actors have obligations. There is no doubt that present governments today have obligations towards those living in the far future. This is difficult to accept and implement for politicians, civil servants, and policymakers, who usually act for the short term and for immediate results. In particular, politicians often do not look beyond the date of the next elections. Recently, case law has shown that domestic courts increasingly rule that also companies have obligations and responsibilities to make a contribution to the protection of the environment, for example, by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In addition, it should not be forgotten that Article 29 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights provides that everyone has duties towards the community. And Article 30 of that declaration stipulates that states, groups, or persons do not have a right to engage in any activity aimed at the destruction of any of the rights and freedoms of the Universal Declaration. The considerations just mentioned imply that, from a general perspective, states have an obligation to respect, meaning that they must do no harm themselves by violating the rights of future generations. They have an obligation to protect by regulating, monitoring, and sanctioning the conduct of private actors. They also have an obligation to prevent by taking precautionary measures as a duty of care. Finally, they have a duty to fulfill by creating an enabling and constructive environment aimed at securing the human rights of future generations at the short, medium, and long term. The latter can be done, for example, by establishing a prior permanent impact assessment test on the effects of bills for new legislation and new policy measures on the human rights of future generations. Being a member of a global society means that one's human rights may be affected by conduct of actors who are outside of the territory where one lives. Transboundary pollution of water, air, and soil, and the effects of climate change are clear and well-known examples. This means that present states do not only have territorial obligations, but also extraterritorial obligations that go beyond national borders and are also of a global nature on the basis of the principle of solidarity and international cooperation aimed at securing worldwide sustainability. I now arrive at a number of concluding remarks about the human rights of future generations. It is abundantly clear that there is an urgent need to act now to safeguard the human rights of members of future generations. Let me quote Grotius' personal motto, which may inspire all of us, Ruit hora, which means time is running away. This is appropriate for our times as well. We have to use the present time to the best of our abilities to preserve human life in the future and protect the planet. The notion of human rights and human rights language is appealing to many all over the world, in particular the marginalized and the vulnerable. The basics of a legal framework to protect the human rights of members of future generations is there. It already consists of rights and obligations. However, it needs to be expanded and applied to the human beings that do not exist yet. A set of Maastricht principles as a legal expert opinion can contribute to this process. States need to be conscious of and contribute to this development, which is the common concern of humankind. This requires political will, determination, and courage. It makes sense that we take responsibility now for our present and future conduct that may affect the lives of our offspring. In this way, we are able to act as representatives or guardians of those who do not exist yet as human beings, but who will have to deal with the effects of our present conduct. As most of you will know, the chair I have occupied for almost 15 years is the UNESCO Chair for Human Rights and Peace. That means that the chair has been established by UNESCO headquarters in consultation with the Netherlands National UNESCO Commission. UNESCO has a constitutional mandate to contribute to the promotion of human rights and peace. The Preamble of UNESCO's constitution stipulates, and I quote, "Since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed," unquote. The focus of UNESCO is on the right to education, the right to participate in cultural life, the right to freedom of opinion and expression, including the right to seek, receive, and impart information, and the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications. The idea was and still is that these rights will contribute to a culture of peace, freedom, and justice between and within states and societies. UNESCO chairs have a role to play in achieving these goals through education, research, and international collaboration. Human rights education for students is essentially about explaining that human rights are about the inclusion of people, not their exclusion on discriminatory grounds. It is about cultural diversity, tolerance, respect, mutual understanding, equality of opportunities, and protecting marginalized and vulnerable groups close to home, but also beyond national borders. What I have tried to do in my master courses on human rights at the Faculty of Law of our university, but also in Venice at the master program in human rights and democratization, is to teach students from different cultural backgrounds about the universality of human rights within their different cultural, political, social, and economic settings. Internationally, the Maastricht UNESCO Chair has collaborated with partners in the Global South, such as Udayama University in Bali, the University of Fort Hare in East London, South Africa, and also through my visiting professorship at the University of Cape Town. I want to thank Budi and Ayu from Bali for the wonderful teaching experiences when developing a problem-based learning human rights course for their staff and students in Bali. Professor Rembe from Fort Hare University, also a UNESCO chairholder, introduced me to that university. We jointly organized a conference on rights-based governance in South Africa. Perhaps I have learned most from the lively and rich academic climate and debate at the University of Cape Town, where Professor Leslie London introduced a human rights-based approach in his courses at the School of Public Health and Family Medicine, to which I was able to contribute. In the Netherlands, we are fortunate to have the Netherlands Network for Human Rights Research, of which Maastricht is an active member. It successfully brings together junior and senior researchers in the Netherlands in the field of human rights. In particular, the training events for PhD students are one of the strengths of this network. Our faculty has organized several training sessions on methods of human rights research for the network. I want to thank the members of the steering committee of the network, led by Professor Yvonne Donders, for the fruitful and pleasant collaboration for so many years. Locally, Maastricht University, together with the municipality of Maastricht, Amnesty International, and Mondiaal Maastricht, is a partner in the Shelter City Maastricht project, which offers a place of temporary rest and relief for human rights defenders whose lives are at risk in the countries where they live and work. I'm happy that Sebastian van der Zwaan, the Director of Justice and Peace in The Hague, and an alumnus from our faculty, has taken the initiative to start the Shelter City program and involve Maastricht as a shelter city. At the faculty, I have held several management positions over the years. As head of the department in the period 2009-2013, I have seen the department steadily growing in size and cultural diversity. I must say, honestly, that I do not envy the current head, Professor Ellen Vos, who almost has a full-time job managing the still expanding group of people. Thank you very much, Ellen, for our good collaboration during all these years. I have been the chairperson of the faculty's science committee, and in that capacity, together with Patrick van Eijs, as its unsurpassed secretary, led many rounds of recruiting new PhD students for our faculty. I want to thank the members of the science committee who, in consultation with the Vice Dean for Research, have developed and professionalized together the policy and standards for training and evaluating PhD researchers, but also more generally, the evaluation of the quality of research output at our faculty. I'm grateful for the support received from the executive board of our university, in particular from Professor Rianne Letchert. She was the person I did not have to convince of the importance of human rights research and teaching. As for the Faculty of Law, I'm thankful for the good and constructive collaboration with the board. In particular, Professor Jan Smits and Professor Monica Klaas. They have always recognized human rights teaching and research as one of the key strengths of our faculty's profile. The Maastricht Center for Human Rights is well known internationally for its research in the area of social, economic, and cultural rights. We have a critical mass of excellent young and more senior researchers who have all made important contributions to developing human rights law on these rights and of particular groups such as disabled people, women, and children. I'm grateful for the collaboration and friendship with Jennifer Saline, Liza Waddington, Ingrid Westendorp, Andrea Broderick, Gustavo Arsamena, and Marieke Hopman. And of course, the supervision of many PhD students, which is perhaps the part of my job that I have enjoyed most. This has all been facilitated by the excellent secretarial support and administrative support provided by Chantal Kuipers and Elke Houndhausen, who in a very professional way have put our center on the map. I also want to thank the members of the board of the Center for Human Rights for the sense of joint responsibility for activities of the center. It is now time to hand over to a generation of younger colleagues. I also look back with gratitude to the work of former colleagues who have paved the way for the center as it is today and have been a source of inspiration in many respects. Menno Kamminga, Fred Grunveld, and Ria Wolleswinkel, and especially Theo van Boven and Kees Flinterman. The center and I owe a lot to you. Recently, I have handed over the position of Director of the Center for Human Rights to Roland Moerland and Andrea Broderick as new co-directors. I'm confident that the two of you will be able to bring together members of the center with different backgrounds to work on common issues and projects of human rights. Finally, I'm very happy that recently Andrea Broderick has been appointed as my successor as the UNESCO chair. Dear Andrea, a long and winding road has come to an end. You have made a speedy career and worked very hard. I wish you success and wisdom, both in your professional and personal life. And may the human rights of future generations be a source of inspiration for you. I will not leave completely from the faculty. I will keep a position as Professor Emeritus, so you will see me around regularly. Perhaps I can volunteer for renovating the inner garden of the faculty, which I have enjoyed for so many years from my quiet office, which unfortunately I have to give up. I come to a conclusion, but not before thanking warmly my wife Lillian, who has been a beacon of support and encouragement in my career, and emphasized many times that work is certainly not the most important thing in life. I must say honestly that I did not always follow that good and wise advice. I hope that my new status as a pensionado will help in doing more and new things together that we both enjoy. Ik heb gezegd.
Dear Fons, thank you so much for this impressive lecture. Connecting the human rights of future generations to the research and teaching that you have been doing in Maastricht and to your own academic career over the years made it truly wonderful to listen to you. Thank you so much for this. And you are indeed hired as of now to renovate the faculty garden. Now, dear Fons and dear Lillian, this is of course not the end of this academic ceremony. Several people are very eager to address you. Before I'm going to ask the first of these colleagues to come forward, I would like to say a few words myself. I do so as Dean on behalf of the Faculty of Law of our university. Fons, your retirement makes us sad and a bit melancholic. In fact, it is no reason for celebration at all. We are all going to miss you. And yet what we do celebrate today is your great contribution to our faculty and our university in the many roles that you have had with us. Several of these roles were already highlighted, also in the introduction by our rector and also by yourself, as a stimulating researcher, as an inspiring teacher, and as someone who, over the years, took up, and I think you were a bit too modest there, took up many leadership positions in our faculty, including, indeed, as head of the Department of International and European Law, as director of the Center, Maastricht Center for Human Rights in the last 10 years, and indeed, in fact, until the day before yesterday, as the chair of our science committee, affectionately called the WC in the inner circles of our faculty. These days we speak a lot about recognition and rewards and about the importance of academic citizenship, rightly so, but long before this term, academic citizenship, became fashionable also in the Netherlands, you showed what that actually means. And for the faculty board, and I also speak here on behalf of Monica, sitting right over there, and Sjoerd, also sitting here in the audience, and also on behalf of you, the secretary to the Science Committee, Patrick van Eijs, who we already mentioned. Your work in recent years for the Science Committee has helped us a lot, and I want to also thank you, particularly in recent years there, for that. It's a job you have done with great delicacy and great attention for the person behind the academic. And typical for you, as in all your work, you always tried to keep the good atmosphere in that committee, but also in all your other leadership roles, and to involve everyone in the decision-making process. Fons, how did it all start? As is often the case, your academic career started with a letter. A letter in which you applied for the position of assistant in the field of human rights at the then Rijksuniversiteit Limburg. What was the year? The year was 1985. And guess what? I have the letter right here. Just show it to you. I'm not sure if you remember what the letter starts with. You don't? It starts, Fons, with the sentence, "Mijne heren." I'm not sure that would still do it, very well these days, but probably at that time it did work because you got the position. So that was really good. You were appointed on the 1st of September 1985 as wetenschappelijk assistent, the position that was still there at that time, no longer exists. And it was also your first job as the political scientist that you were by training. You ended up here in an environment of jurists, of lawyers. Even though you were not a lawyer by training, I think you became, in fact, a lawyer over the years by being infected and being exposed to all these lawyers around you here in Maastricht, but also in the many networks that you worked in. So I'm almost inclined to say that you were indeed infected also with the legal virus. You're not a lawyer by training, but you were a lawyer by contamination. Perhaps we should put it like that. You started in a very young faculty, a faculty that had only existed when you came for 4 years at that point in time. And the good thing is, Fons, you never left. You stayed with us for 37 years and helped to build the faculty to what it is today. Building upon the PhD you defended in 1992, I'm also really happy that we have professors Van Boven and Flinterman, your two supervisors, promotores, both here with us today. And you were, Fons, highly popular, I noted, when I just looked at your resume within our faculty. Highly popular, because several of our departments were, in fact, fighting to have you in their department. You started in the Department of International and European Law, Then you moved to the Department of Public Law, and then again you moved back, much to their benefit, to the Department of International and European Law. But there's really too much to say about everything that you did in all those years. I just want to highlight one aspect, and that's your commitment to both academic work and putting that work into practice. You already said a lot about that also yourself, and I even believe it's a characteristic trait of our Maastricht Center for Human Rights, to which you have been so much committed ever since its founding in 1993. It was in fact the first research center that we founded as a faculty at that time. Your approach to human rights, to economic, social and cultural rights, like that of the center, has always been not only to theorize those rights, but also to put them indeed into practice, to see how they can in fact work in practice. You mentioned that's no exaggeration, the world famous sets of principles that were made within the center, and you were involved in the making of all three sets. I'm not going to mention here the full name of those principles, because I promised I would speak for no more than 5 minutes. But let's call them the principles with the long name. What I actually found very interesting, and it also came back in your own lecture, and I see Dr. Augustin Parise sitting over there in the audience, is that earlier this week we had an opening here in this building of a great exhibition on the Grimm brothers, and the law. It's a wonderful exhibition. Do have a look when you go outside, just 10 meters from the exit of this room. And at the opening of that exhibition, I was there. I thought what Fons did for these ESC rights is in fact very similar to what Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm tried to do with their fairy tales, namely to uncover potentially deeper values and culture. Now, talking about putting theory, I have to think about my 5 minutes, apologies. But there's so much to say. Thinking about theory and practice, I of course mentioned your UNESCO chair on human rights and peace, and I thank in particular the Netherlands UNESCO committee for facilitating this chair and for continuing to do so also in the coming years, with the new chairholder, Professor Broderick, sitting also on the first row. And I mention also in that same context of theory and practice, indeed the Shelter City Initiative of Justice and Peace, Nederland. Thanks to you, Fons, I also had the pleasure of meeting several of these impressive human rights defenders who visited our faculty and attended courses that we have on offer, in particular also in the field of human rights. All examples that show the link you have always sought between academic work and the practice of human rights. In this respect, and that's the final remark I'm going to make about it, you also made our rector very happy, because everyone here, I think, will remember the impressive ceremony at which Professor Habibovic took over the rectorship, where she said Maastricht University may not be the biggest university in the Netherlands, but it can make the most impact. That's what you also did, contributing to impact in the area of human rights. Fons, many thanks for your manifold contributions to the growth and development of our university and faculty. We owe you. As I said, I'm not the only one addressing you today, and I want to invite the head of she was already mentioned, the head of the Department of International and European Law, Professor Vos, to come forward.
Thank you. So we already have heard that Fons Coomans, as a professor of human rights and peace, has given an invaluable contribution to the academic debates on human rights, whilst he has also played an important management role in the faculty as head of department of International European Law from 2009 to 2013, as a member of the Science Faculty, the Faculty Science Committee for many years, of which he was from 2017 to 2022, the chair. He was also the director of the Maastricht Center for Human Rights. Fons has been a very much appreciated colleague, always calm, reliable, modest, we heard also this morning, discreet, and finding the time to listen to colleagues and trying to find ways to help where necessary. It has been wonderful to work with you, Fons. Much has been already said about Fons' career path, and I'm not going to repeat that here. I would like to highlight a few key points. And of course, I also would like to emphasize the Limburg and Maastricht principles and guidelines. Fons has played an active role in developing the so-called 1986 Limburg principles, and I will use my 5 minutes to mention these, the long name. So it is the implementation of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights that were adopted in Maastricht. These principles clarify the nature and the scope of states' parties' obligations under the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. The purpose of this 1986 expert meeting with more than 200 experts was to provide the newly established UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights with ideas on the clarification of the nature of the states' parties' obligations resulting from the Covenant. As I said before, Fons has been, over the year, an active promoter of social and economic rights and has contributed to the further development of the now so-called Maastricht principles. So he has contributed in 1997 to the adoption of the Maastricht guidelines on the violations of economic and social and cultural rights, discussing questions such as how states can be held accountable if, for example, there is not enough food for people in a country. Is that a violation of the right for food? In 2011, the Maastricht Principles on Extraterritorial Human Rights Obligations were adopted, answering questions such as, do states also have obligations beyond national borders? And now we have heard today, Fons calls for the development of new Maastricht Principles on future generations, asking how the human rights of future generations can be protected. All this underlines that Fons has not only been actively contributing to the academic debate on human rights, but has also contributed and is still contributing to important societal questions, including the concern about the future of our students and our children. Second point I would like to make is that, as already has been highlighted, that Fons has served more than 8 years as a director of the Maastricht Center for Human Rights. This center was set up in 1993 by Thea van Boven, the former director of the UN Division of Human Rights, and Kees Flinterman, are very much appreciated emeriti professors now, who are also present here. Fons took over the directorship of the center from Menno Kamminga, also present here, in 2014, and has set two thematic research lines for the center: globalization and human rights, and criminal law and criminology in an international and comparative perspective. Within the research for the center, Fons himself has published on a variety of topics. In addition to further developing the Maastricht Principles, he researched, amongst others, the need to protect human rights by strong state obligations, the Precautionary Principle, as you yourself mentioned today, very important, the right to food, development rights of children, and the right to education of migrants, and many, many other topics. A third point I would like to mention concerns the supervision of PhD researchers. Fons attaches high importance to the supervision of PhD researchers and the education of the next generation academics with an expertise in human rights. It is therefore no coincidence that the symposium of this morning has been organized by several of his former PhD researchers, while several of them and even students, in fact, have given a presentation. Fons successfully supervised 22 PhD researchers, and there are still some PhD researchers that he still supervises today. Typical of the supervision of Fons is the broad variety of topics that he has supervised and the diversity in the nationalities of the PhD researchers he supervised, coming from all over the world, such as Namibia, China, South Africa, and Uganda. And Fons has always been a very patient and careful listening PhD supervisor, as Gustavo said this morning as well, not guiding the people, but not telling them the direction and leaving really them in full, completely academic freedom, which is very much appreciated by all your PhD researchers. The last point I would like to mention is that is the importance that Fons attaches to the collaboration with NGOs. Fons has, for example, collaborated a lot with FIAN International, and he very much supported the Justice and Peace Shelter City program, being the host of many human rights defenders here in Maastricht. All the conferences Fons organized were therefore always a meeting place of academic and practitioners. Fons finds it key that academic research, debates and findings are also put in practice and that changes take place in the human rights practice. This has typified Fons as an academic with always a lot of attention to the individual case and practice. And as Yvonne Donders called it this morning or this afternoon, Fons has an academic head and an activist heart, in fact, for human rights. Fons, we're all very happy that you continue to work with us as an emeritus professor so that we will continue to see you and collaborate with you. You will now have more time to make long walks, which during the week do not longer have to be limited to the lunch breaks. So we wish you lots of good and long walks and nice visits to all the islands you want still to visit with Lilian. Thank you very much for everything. I would like now to hand over the floor to my colleagues, Andrea Broderick, Professor of Human Rights and Peace, and Jennifer Salin, Assistant Professor of Human Rights, who will say a few words and hand over another surprise, Fons. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Dear Fons, it has been my great pleasure and much more than that, a great privilege to work with you so closely over the last 10 years. I will reserve my personal remarks till the end because this is a sad day for me to see you in your last official day at Maastricht University, although I know you will be seen around the corridors. As Ellen has already mentioned, we have a small surprise for you. I know you don't like surprises, but we just have a small surprise for you. Together with Jennifer, I've organized a Liberamic Quorum for you, which is in addition to the booklet of recollections that we gave to you earlier today. As we all know, Fons has done prolific work in the field of socioeconomic rights. He has concentrated on strengthening the status of socioeconomic rights, developing the normative content, and elucidating state obligations in that regard. I'm not going to repeat all the documents that were repeated a few minutes ago, but all of these were done while Fons was together with other colleagues in the Maastricht Center for Human Rights.
So the volume that we are editing, it's an edited book, is titled Socioeconomic Rights, Inequalities and Vulnerabilities in Times of Crisis, Building Back Better. And this is a work in progress, and it will be ready later next year. And this is an edited book where we will reflect on past, present, and future of the enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights, and on how to reduce inequalities for marginalized and vulnerable groups, especially in the context of emergency situations such like COVID-19. And a key concept that we want to discuss in this book is that idea of building back better and how we can inform states to have resilience when we're dealing with economic crisis or with any kind of crisis in the future.
So the book is going to be published with Edward Elgar Publishers, and it will be published within the Association of Human Rights Institute series. So I must thank Ingrid Westendorp, our colleague, for facilitating that publication. Jennifer has a cover page in a frame because we did not manage to get it together on time, unfortunately, but at least we have the cover page for you.
Okay, so the authors who will write some chapters for this book are all your former PhD candidates, Fons, and some of them are here in the room, which is really nice. So the authors include me, of course, and Andrea, and then we have Brigitte Tubus, who is here, Yvonne Donnos, who is also here, Dalia Palombo, who was also here, Gustavo Arosomena, that we saw this morning, who's also here, Jasper Krommendijk, I've also seen Kasim Balarabe, who will be participating, who participated this morning online, then is Remy Shawa, who is also participating, Vanessa Tunsmeyer, who is also in the room indeed. And these are the authors, and we are very, very delighted that Kees Flinterman has agreed to write the foreword for the book. Thank you.
So Fons, we hope you will enjoy reading the book as much as we enjoyed putting the book almost together, not together yet, and seeing the product of your PhD candidates' work in print. Above all, I really think this book will be a lasting legacy of your prolific work in the field of socioeconomic rights. And given your link to the rights of future generations, I think future generations will really benefit from seeing the work of your former PhDs together in one volume. On behalf of the members of the Maastricht Centre for Human Rights, I really want to thank you also on behalf of Roland, who is there somewhere, for everything you have done, your dedication, your time, and your commitment to the centre. It really means a lot. I'm very sure that the members of our department and also the faculty as a whole will join me enthusiastically in thanking you, as has already been said, for all your work for the department. And on a personal note, firstly, thank you for your very kind words in your speech. I want to say thank you for being a fantastic mentor, a great colleague, a very dear friend. I hope I can do you justice, since justice is so close to your heart. And I just want to say you're never going to be too far away from the corridors of this university. Thank you, Fons.
Professor Coomans, dear Fons, what a beautiful afternoon. I really hope you enjoyed it. I must say, after hearing your farewell lecture, I feel kind of reassured that experts like you and your colleagues have the attention for the rights of our future generations. So on behalf of the board, I would like to thank you once again for all your contribution to our university, to the Faculty of Law. And I'm glad to hear that you will be around in the corridors, in the garden, and that you don't have to apply for this position, because I could not help but count quickly the gowns in the first row, and I don't think that mine here would work this time. But I'm sure you are also happy that this has changed since 1985. So with that, I would like to thank everybody for joining us today and for paying a tribute, such a beautiful tribute to the work of Professor Coomans. And before I close, I need to say that Fons has indicated that you do not have to line up to congratulate or say goodbye, but just go to the garden and enjoy drinks, and you will get the opportunity to meet and talk. So thank you once again on behalf of Maastricht University, and hereby I close this academic ceremony.